Yes, there were fantasy books before Lord of the Rings. So I am talking today about Phantastes by George MacDonald. This was published in 1858 and it's often regarded as the first fantasy novel. Yes, there were other books with fantastical things in them, like Homer's Odyssey, and then there were fairy stories for kids, but this is the first fairy story for grown-ups. In fact, the book has a subtitle in some editions. Mine just says Phantastes, a fairy romance, but in some it says a fairy romance for men and women. This book had an influence on C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and in my copy there's actually an introduction by C.S. Lewis. And it's funny because C.S. Lewis basically says George MacDonald does not write great prose, but he does praise his story, or rather the pattern of the events, his myth-making. And I kind of agree, the construction of his sentences is often really tortured and long-winded. I've counted, and sometimes his sentences go on for 8 lines, which is not necessarily a bad thing. There are some authors that can pull that off, but George MacDonald can't. And sometimes there's paragraphs that go on for 2 pages, so it's like you turn the page and it's just a wall of text. The other thing is the writing has a kind of dreamlike quality to it. It's not very concrete, which is maybe what he was going for because it's set in fairyland, but it does make your mind wander. And there's also an awful lot of telling and not showing. In fact, Ed over at Dutch Greybeard DNF'd this book because he just couldn't handle it anymore. So what is this story about? Well, very basically, it's about a guy that goes through a portal into the fairy world, and then he just travels through it without much sense of purpose or direction. That's about it. So a few random thoughts I had while reading this. Does this guy ever eat? He's just walking and never eating. How does he get any food? There was one really enjoyable part. He gets to this palace and there's a library in the palace and he reads some of the stories in the library and they're embedded into the book. I think one's about 8 pages and the other one's about 20 pages long. And those stories themselves are actually really good and they have really fantastical elements. And when I say that, I mean they're kind of set in alternate universes where our physical laws don't apply. Like in one of them, the women in the story have wings and they don't have babies. They just go out into nature and find them. And I think it's this kind of thing that caught Lewis's imagination, the idea that actually I don't have to write about our world. I can just make stuff up. I can write about a world that doesn't conform to the way things work in our universe. And then the book goes on, it gets a little bit more direction, but it's still very weird. There's some goblins and kobolds. And at a certain point I realized, oh, okay, I can see the influence this had on C.S. Lewis, like the Dufflepuds in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which just make no sense whatsoever. But it's just this kind of fantastical element that C.S. Lewis has in some of his Narnia books. Anyway, the book goes on and then it ends, and I'm kind of at a loss to remember what actually happened. It's so vague. Such strange things happen. Oh, and there's more and more poetry as the book goes on as well, which is not my favorite thing. I think Lewis also comments on the poetry as not being great. So, in terms of giving this a score, I was originally thinking of giving this a 3, but I actually have decided to give it a 4. The way I rate books is obviously subjective. It's what I think about the book in terms of whether I like it or not. But I also do temper my scores depending on how important I think the book is. And I think this shows what's possible in a fantasy story. And the fact that it did that so long ago, I think is worth something. So I have absolutely no desire to read this ever again, but I have to give it its due for what a major new thing this was at the time. So if you're interested in the origins of fantasy, give this a go. I did a live stream with Ed over at Dutch Greybeard talking about this and The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. So go and check that out. I'd be interested to know if you've read this. Please leave a comment. I'd like to know if you enjoyed it or suffered through it. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe if you haven't already, and go and check out my other videos. I will see you in the next one. See ya. Have you read this? I'd be interested to know what you think of it, whether you thought it was absolute